Can you actually ask honest questions of atheists? Trinity Radio is going to try, and for that, he does get my thanks. Yet, I see a lot of the same inherent problems in his list as I do in most others. Theists simply don't understand how to get outside of their own heads. And that's where the problems come in. So, let's see a new attempt. Stick around. So today, we're going to take a look at the first half of 10 Questions for Atheists on the Trinity Radio channel. He points out something that I've said for a very long time, that most of these lists are just gotcha questions aimed at making the followers of the theist happy. And that's just dumb. So I appreciate this guy recognizing that and trying to do better. I just don't know how much better he actually did, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. So anyhow, here comes part 1 of a 2-part video on some honest questions for atheists, and here come my honest answers. Enjoy!
The worldview discussions space can be so combative. And when atheists and Christians come up with lists of questions that they don't think the other side can answer, those questions usually aren't genuine.
Which I agree with, at least coming from the atheist side. I have yet to ever see a question from a Christian or from any other religious group which I would consider genuine. And I've pointed this out before, but it's usually an attempt at a gotcha. A question they are expecting a singular answer to, which can then be twisted to appeal to their religious audience. They don't really care what we say. They aren't really curious about our answers. They're just looking to reinforce their own beliefs and to attract more acolytes. And that isn't honest, but it is true. So far, I give this guy at least some credit for getting that part right.
I've never made a list like that, although I've responded to some. Here, I hope my atheist interlocutors will consider these questions deeply without giving glib answers.
I always do that. The problem is that most questions posed, they don't really need to be asked because the answers are already out there, freely available. They don't need to know what we think, because they're not really questions for atheists. They're often questions for science, and they're not asking scientists. They're not doing any kind of independent research. They can't even manage a single simple Google search because they don't really care. They've just found these questions on some website somewhere, and they're trying to score some brownie points. They have no real curiosity for what we have to say, and they're not going to intelligently consider anything that we answer regardless. It's what makes these Q&A sessions ultimately a complete waste of time.
These aren't meant to be gotcha questions, though I'm not asking for no reason. I expect you will have answers, and I want to hear what the most sincere among you have to say.
Well, what makes one answer more sincere than another? And that's a fair question, and one that a lot of theists simply can't answer. A lot will just say, well, I want sincere, honest answers. And then they declare anything that they can't twist to their own purposes insincere and dishonest, because that's not really what they're looking for. And I'm not really sure how that works. But anyhow, get on with your questions, and let's see if you're any different.
With that, here are my 10 questions for atheists. What facts about reality that you and I agree are real facts about the way the world is does your worldview account for, but my Christianity doesn't account for, or at least doesn't account for well?
The overwhelming majority of them, because your worldview simply inserts magic in place of objective, demonstrable fact. Now, granted, I don't know this guy, and I don't know exactly what he believes, so please take that statement with a grain of salt. It's just that anywhere that the religious insert God into the mix, that's rationally indefensible, full stop. You can't prove any of it, whereas science is based on demonstrable evidence and objective fact. The religious simply don't have any of that. All they can do is say, well, God did it, and hope someone takes them seriously. And I don't, because there's no good reason to. Why is God did it a more valid answer than Allah did it, or Vishnu did it, or the flying spaghetti monster did it? What makes your God any better than anyone else's God when you all have exactly the same evidence for your claims? And that amount is none. None at all. Just because you found an explanation that you think is emotionally comforting, that doesn't make your explanation true.
And for those of you that would point out atheism isn't a worldview, I'm talking about your worldview that includes atheism.
I really don't have one. I know the religious like to think I do. They really like the idea, but I personally wholeheartedly reject the idea of having an overlay placed onto reality through which the objective facts must be viewed. I don't want to have a belief system through which I have to interpret reality. I prefer to look at reality raw. The sun appears to rise in the morning through well-understood, entirely verifiable scientific principles. I don't have to pretend that some imaginary deity does it, whether directly or indirectly. It is what it actually is, and that's all I care about.
I can't think of any. Christianity accounts for evil, suffering, the existence of other religions, including supernatural events in those other religions, science, and differences among different denominations of Christianity.
No, it doesn't. It rationalizes those things. It says, here is what we believe, and then attempts to square those things with your pre-existing beliefs. And that's why there are more than 42,000 distinct sects of Christianity out there, because not everyone rationalizes these things the same way. And the biggest problem here is that there's no way to prove objectively that you've come to any kind of rational conclusion. Because religion, by its very nature, isn't about finding demonstrable truth. It's about achieving emotional comfort. It's about feeling good about the things that you've stuffed into your head, whether those things are factually correct or not. And whether you like it or not, that's a problem.
But I can think of many things that the most common worldviews that include atheism don't answer as well as I think Christianity does. Like universal supernatural claims, universal religious experiences, free will, morality, near-death experiences, beauty, the rapid expansion of the early church, the events surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, and our shared longing for purpose and meaning.
The answers to all of those things are very easy. Most of them are just bullshit. I don't have time to get into most of that at the moment. This video is going to be long enough as it is, but I've addressed most, if not all of those things in the past, and there's no mystery there whatsoever. Yet, as I said, the religious are into rationalization, not rationality. They take the ideas they already have in their heads, and they look for how to explain things based entirely on that, whether any of that's actually true or not. They start off with, well, because I'm right, and then they construct an ad hoc rationalization through their particular religious lens. They just like that idea, and therefore it has to be right too. They don't need independently corroborable evidence to support it. It just makes them happy, so it's got to be so. And that's not how reality actually works.
So what is it that Christianity doesn't answer as well as your worldview?
It's not enough to just come up with an explanation yanked straight out of your ass. You actually have to prove that what you come up with comports accurately with objective reality, which is where Christianity, indeed all religions, fall down. Just because you can say it's true, that doesn't mean that it's actually true until you can prove that it's true. Prove. That's the important part here. You must provide objectively demonstrable evidence for your beliefs. And that's what Christianity simply cannot do, and that's a problem.
If your definition of atheism is merely that it's a lack of belief in God and you're just waiting to be convinced, but then you speak of him as though he's in some way synonymous with Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or fairies, doesn't that at least send the message to your listeners that you actually believe that there is no God?
Of course not, because so far as we can tell, there is no difference, none at all, between any God and made-up things like Santa Claus and Harry Potter. If it looks like a duck and it smells like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then for all intents and purposes, it's a duck, no matter how unhappy that might make you. Because none of this is about how it feels or whatever. It's about what is objectively demonstrable in the real world. There is nothing in any religion that I've studied, and that's a fair number, which would lead me to conclude, based on the evidence, that any of this is anything but entirely made up. The religious need to do a whole lot better than they're doing, and for some reason, they can't get that through their heads. Why? Because this is really all about emotional comfort, not defensible truth, not objective fact. And that's really not anything to be proud of.
After all, these are entities and beings that you likely believe do not exist.
It's always nice to have the religious tell us what we believe, isn't it? Because this is all too common. In fact, I don't believe that gods do not exist. I have never once said that gods do not exist. I do not believe that Bigfoot does not exist. I do not believe that the Loch Ness Monster does not exist. I simply have not been convinced that any of them do, and as such, I will proceed as though they do not exist. After all, you have no choice but to do so given any undemonstrated proposition. But that doesn't mean I have an active belief that any of these things are absolutely not real. Once again, this is the religious trying to pretend that everyone is just like they are. We all have to have the same kind of thought processes and come to the same conclusions that they do, even if we demonstrably do not. And this is a constant problem with the religious, if you notice. It's one thing to argue that people should think the same way. Rationally in my case, because I think all people ought to be rational. I don't pretend that they do think that way, however, because clearly, especially when it comes to the religious, they don't.
And if your response is that you merely lack a belief in Santa Claus and don't actively believe that he does not exist, doesn't that sound a little disingenuous, honestly?
Nope. In fact, it's the most honest position you can have. Now, granted, I have zero confidence in Santa Claus because we know that the stories about Santa Claus are all just made up. But there's a difference between a story and reality. There could be something we could define as Santa Claus out there somewhere that bears little or no resemblance to the stories. Just as there could be something that we could define as a god out there that looks nothing like any of the religions that have been invented. We don't know, and that's the thing. The only time a rational person takes a positive position on anything is when that thing is supported by objective evidence and rational evaluation. In both the cases for Santa Claus and gods, No such evidence exists. Thus, it is rationally impossible to take a positive position either way in either case. I think the chances of there being a Santa Claus that matches the stories or a God that matches the religions, both of those are infinitesimally small, but they're not zero. Not really. They're pretty damn close, but not zero. I don't take a positive position on the matter in either case, because I am being rational.
When atheism becomes a part of someone's worldview, they typically change their positions on other issues like abortion, sexual morality, and a number of other things.
Not necessarily. Politically, I'm a conservative. Always have been, and so far as I'm concerned, unless something weird happens, I always will be. Certainly, some things did change after I stopped being a Christian, simply because those positions were only held because of my religious beliefs. Without those beliefs, they made no sense and they needed to be reevaluated. For some things, I found other reasons why those positions were the best, the most defensible positions I could hold, and for others, they fell away and changed based on the new evidence that I found. And that's a good thing. The idea that you ought to believe things because of some irrational faith that you hold, that's really pretty absurd when you think about it. It's why I don't do it that way any longer, and neither should you. Everything should be regularly put to the test. No position should ever be held on faith, and everything should be based on evidence and critical thinking. Yet the religious go right back to expecting everyone to be just like they are, and we're just not. Maybe you should talk to us instead of about us. Just saying.
I actually have several videos of well-known atheists saying that there's nothing wrong with prostitution, that they hope their children don't save themselves until marriage, and that sex workers should be put up on a pedestal no different than the military.
And they are every bit as welcome to their opinions as you are. I don't necessarily agree with any of those positions, but they're welcome to their own views on them. And you have lots of Christians who think that white people are inherently better than black people based on their religious views. The entire American slave trade was primarily based on Christianity, if you remember. And that's not something that can be historically denied. I think those people have a right to their opinions too, even though I strongly disagree with them. And that's the basis of free speech, after all, standing up for someone's rights to say what they think, no matter how strongly you disagree. Then you can have a conversation to figure out why these things are favored and why they're not. It's how people come to rational compromises. Yeah, but anyhow, let's let him continue.
I didn't use those here because I didn't want to seem combative to individuals, specifically the individuals who made those statements. But even if you didn't become an atheist just so you could sin, and I believe you, do you at least understand why those moves could send that message to people who might say that to you?
Do you understand that atheists don't believe that sin is even a thing? Because that seems to be a problem with a lot of Christians. So let's go back to square one. Do you understand that, in my case at least, since I can't speak for anyone else, I didn't stop believing in a God so I could go and do other things. I stopped believing in a God because there was no good evidence for the existence of a God. The other things had absolutely zero impact on my decision. But the religious, they can't imagine not believing in a God, so they try desperately to recontextualize the discussion so that they're more comfortable with the outcome. Except their comfort doesn't really mean anything. Who cares how they feel about reality? The only thing that matters is reality itself. The religious need to start dealing with the things that people actually say instead of trying to reframe it within their own religious context. Because that never, ever, ever works.
If it's a lack of belief sort of atheism, what is it? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 75-25? And at what point do you feel disingenuous saying that you merely lack a belief as opposed to leaning towards, I believe that God does not exist?
I will believe that God does not exist when there is evidence that God does not exist and not 1 second before. That's the point. Belief is a positive assertion. It is the position that something is true, not might be true, not could be true, is true. I have no evidence of any kind that gods absolutely are not real, nor do I have any evidence of any kind that any gods are real. Therefore, I cannot make a positive assertion, and neither can you, not if you hope to maintain any kind of rationality. If I had to say which way I'm leaning, yeah, it's definitely towards the non-existent side, but that's not an assertion that I can make because, again, there is zero evidence to back it up, nor, if you think about it, can there be. Things that don't exist don't leave evidence for their own non-existence. This is basic logic 101. The religious ought to try to get that through their heads.
Now, I know we've all got our talking points, but I want you to struggle to be as sincere with yourself as you can right now. Doesn't it bother you a little bit that when we come to talk about the origins of the universe, and if there's a multiverse, the origin of that too, that the only real options you've got besides God is a past infinite universe, which is impossible, or the universe coming to exist uncaused out of nothing, or something far less clear than even those?
No, because my position is based on evidence, not feelings. I don't care how it feels. I care only if it's real. I care if it's demonstrable. And that's one of the many, many differences between a lot of rational atheists and most, at least in my experience, theists. They are only in this because it makes them feel good to believe it. And I'm not. I don't care. I recognize that the chemical inputs in my brain don't affect objective reality one bit. It doesn't matter if it makes me happy. In fact, the recognition that the truth is not beholden to my feelings is the starting point of rationality. You aren't the hot shit that you like to think that you are. If I don't know something, I admit I don't know, and I keep looking. Whether not knowing makes you uncomfortable or not, that's entirely irrelevant. You still don't know, and that doesn't grant you a license to just make something up because it makes you happy. Your happiness doesn't make a damn bit of difference. That's what children do. They throw temper tantrums because they don't get their own way. It doesn't matter if they're right or wrong, they just want to be in control, and too bad, so sad, they're just not. And neither are you. Reality is what reality is, whether you're happy with it or not. You just need to grow up and deal with what is, not what you wish was. And that's really all religion is if you think about it, from every shred of evidence that we have. It's an attempt to exert imaginary control over reality by people who value happiness over facts. And that's really, really stupid.
It seems that for any worldview that includes atheism, there's a massive blind spot when it comes to the origin of the universe. And all the attempts to try and circumvent that problem seem desperate and at least far less likely than theism.
And that is, in fact, entirely false, because theism is just a made-up answer to resolve an emotionally uncomfortable reality. We just don't know. Humans have evolved to be pattern-seeking animals. We don't like not knowing, but that doesn't mean you can just make something up because it gives you a dopamine hit in the brain. The facts are the facts, whether you like them or not. When we lack the facts, as we do in the case of the origin of the universe, then we should not come up with our own conclusion. We should say, I don't know, and we should keep looking for evidence. And whether you like it or not, we might never know. We might never find any. We might go to our graves never having a fucking clue. That's life. The time to believe in a God is when you have demonstrable evidence that gods exist and not 1 second before. The time to believe in a multiverse is when you have demonstrable evidence that one exists and not 1 second before. However, there's a lot more theoretical evidence for a multiverse, a lot more mathematical evidence for a multiverse than there has ever been for any god. If you're going to play the odds, that's which way you should go, at least until something better comes along. You never do anything for the feels. You only do it for the reals. And that's what the religious are doing through and through. And that's nothing to be proud of.
My question isn't just what do you typically say about this, because I'm well aware of the responses. My question is simply this. When you step away from the debate mode that it's so easy for us all to get into online, doesn't this issue destabilize you a little bit?
No, and I don't think for 1 second that you should pretend that you know what anyone else is going to say. You've demonstrated that pretty clearly so far. You don't have a clue, and you're hardly alone. I don't run into any theists who actually understand the rational atheist position because they're too busy assuming that everyone is just like they are, and they're just wrong. They always are wrong. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It only matters what is actually true. It doesn't matter what makes you happy. It only matters if your position accurately represents objective reality. Because if your positions do not, then they're just wrong. It's as simple as that. It doesn't matter if it feels wonderful to think that 2 + 2 = 27. You're just wrong. There is an objective reality whether you like it or not. It is whatever it happens to be, and your feelings don't remotely enter into it. Anything that you believe that does not agree with reality is simply mistaken. And you, all theists, ought to stop doing that.
It seems to fit really poorly with any worldview that includes atheism.
Which, of course, isn't a worldview. I get really tired of having to point that out, but it's true. I don't need a lens to look at reality through. I only need reality. Now, yes, there are inherent limitations that humanity has which will color our interpretations of reality. But we can work to eliminate as many of those things as possible, and the things that we can't filter out, we just have to recognize an inherent bias on our part. We may never know the full truth, and that's life. We can only do our best and get as far as we can get. The fact that we might never know all the secrets, that's just the way it goes. Sorry. In no case does that ever give anyone permission to just make things up because it makes them happy or it gets around their own personal discomfort. You don't get to do that. Not if you hope to remain rational. But the religious are really not interested in rationality, are they? It's all feels, no reals, and where reality gets in the way of their comfort, they simply reject reality instead of their own obviously faulty faith. And then they think that there's something wrong with us. Yeah, go figure. Anyhow, that's where I'm going to cut it this time. Otherwise, this is going to be a really long video. Come back next time for the last 5 of his honest questions. And by all means, let me know what you think so far down in the comments. Do you think any of this is particularly honest? Not that I think he's lying or anything. I'm sure these are questions that make perfect sense coming from his religious perspective. It's just that his perspective is really pretty skewed in my opinion. Of course, he's welcome to his opinions, just like I am, but it's really reality that gets to judge whether any of them are actually correct. And I don't think his side will be judged favorably in the end. Anyway, we'll come back to this next time. Hope to see you then.
Bum